of the business. So it's still the same people. They're still getting the same advice and directions from the head office. They're still putting all their money in ruble accounts, which one day they hope to be able to take back. But they're still there and clinging on to the market, the market they have in Russia. Now, of course, some of the subcomponents they have to import from the West. Not all of not you can't do this. They can't all do this, but even a lot of Western brands in Russia apparently increasingly use Russian materials for their products, so that they can sustain this not just for a long time, but they can evolve it considerably. And this person also told me that she also, and she's the sort of she's in the service sector, but she's the sort of person who, again, is the kind of person who these sanctions might have been expected to deter. She's sticking there, and she's already finding other partners, other ways of adapting her business to the new sanctions, and she expects to be sorted through within a couple of months at most. So this is what people do. Russia has self-sufficiency, but it also has the inherent flexibilities that come from being a proper market economy. In some ways, it's more of a market economy today than some of the market economies in the West. So that's one thing I did want to say. So you see, even James Galbraith, even people in Russia itself, are coming back and they're telling me these things, and I think I'm quite convinced that this is all entirely true. Now, I have to say, I'm glad you brought out this topic of a certain draft opinion, because this is the other thing that really concerns me, because we see so many things going on in the United States where it seems to me that law, due process, all those kind of things that we valued, all those things that made the West, if you like, are simply being ignored now. And if we come back to the Russian thing, we have this extraordinary idea that's being floated around of seizing the assets of all these private persons, their yachts, their bank accounts, and giving the money to Ukraine. Now, as I understand it, that is actually illegal in the United States. You can't do that. That's prohibited by the Constitution, and it's prohibited by international law. But it's going to happen. I mean, I can't imagine this bunch who are in power now are going to let a simple thing like the law stand in their way of doing these kind of things. Any thoughts about this, Robert?
I mean, I think it's definitely illegal.
Yeah,
It's in order to take
yeah,
anyone's property,
yeah,
they have to meet certain standards. Now, if it's a foreign government or foreign person's property, then there are less legal remedies available, practically speaking, for them, but not without, but not no remedy. And so there's been plenty, and like including, I'm gonna mispronounce his name, but Oleg Deripaska, however you pronounce it, he brought suit in the United States when they seized various aspects of his property. Typically, what happened is they used to just freeze the property, and they got around the issue of seizure by never actually seizing it. They just froze the accounts, and the account stayed frozen in perpetuity. Maybe this is what the Brits are thinking about the sale of Chelsea proceeds. That they're saying they'll release them to charity of some given choice. The Hunter Biden art project would be probably on the top of the list. But people ask, why did Joe Biden go to Ukraine? Somebody had to pick up that check because Hunter's busy in rehab in Malibu. So, that's the mindset of what's kind of taking place. But I think usually they just freeze it, and they do so for legal reasons. One, political reason, to have it leveraged to say you can easily release it back. And so thus it becomes part of negotiations will release the funds. But the other reason was as long as they didn't seize it and give it to someone else or expend it on something else, then it had a different kind of legal status. It wasn't quite the same as stolen property, which is what this is. This is state sanctioned piracy. We're back to the privateering stage. Not only that, they're actually talking about employing actual privateers. I mean, in the United States, they're talking about giving people a percentage if they locate Russian assets that they get to steal. It's like when we're back to the 1800s. in literal privateer status. For those that don't know, pirates were legal as long as they were given a license to go steal from the other country's ships. That's where the word false flag comes from. Pirates would put up a flag pretending to be the Brits or the Spanish or the French. And in fact, they were just the pirates, and they didn't put the Jolly Pirate up until right at the end. When they were seizing the ship. So to me, all of this, my understanding is the Russian government is already looking at bringing suit everywhere they can to unfreeze these assets and to return these assets. So, and I think an EU official even acknowledged they were annoyed by it, but they acknowledged, well, there are all these laws about property in some of these countries, and I guess we can't steal it right away. It tells you the mindset of these people. But so I think, and there'll be extensive litigation. The big question is, will the executive branch actually obey the law, and will they just take it and spend it? In the same way, the fact they're asking for $40 billion tells you that they're not yet committed to the position of actually spending that money, because that's one of the arguments against the $40 billion. Like, well, you said that you can just spend this money, spend what you stole, don't take more. But there is the intention publicly of stealing it for the purposes of giving it back to Ukraine, which Ukraine's just one big laundromat. That money will come right back out. The idea will go to the ordinary Ukrainian. How much is all the aid over the last 25 years going to the ordinary Ukrainian? How do they end up the poorest country in Europe? If in fact this money was meant for the ordinary person in Ukraine. And this, again, was a resource-rich country. It's not like this is the breadbasket of Europe going back before World War I and the rest. One of the reasons why the Germans and the Russians and the Poles all fought over it in part.
And the top donator to the Hillary Clinton Foundation, to the Clinton Foundation as well.
If you look it up, Ukrainians show up at a lot of places. They show up as the top 10 corruption, top 10 human trafficking in different reports in different years, things like that. But also probably the biolabs were part of that. They're just kind of a cheap colony you could experiment on. You could treat them like an individual rendition. Was this country subject to the whims of the West and the sort of colonial mindset of experimentation and whatnot? But yeah, the top donors to individual donors to the Clinton Foundation came from Ukraine. Ukraine shows up. It's not a coincidence that the number one source of funds for the Biden family for a decade was Ukraine. And, the Hunter, not just Hunter Biden, but Joe and also his brother and his sister, they're all part of the grift. And then they expanded the grift intelligently to add, Johnny Kerry's stepson, to add various other family members that were tied in with the Clinton Foundation and the rest. So there isn't a big name Democrat that didn't get a little, Pelosi's people, or son was connected to it, that didn't get a little bit of the grift that is Ukraine. And that will continue to be a grift with this other funding coming in. But I think in terms of what's happening legally, there are limitations. I think there'll be a lot of fights over the sanctions cases. I think their ability to get away with it, at least in the United States, will probably be restricted. The only question is what the courts will do about it. Will they have the political courage to do what they did not have the political courage to do during much of the lockdowns, during a lot of others, during the election fornication that took place, which was extraordinary. So, Joe Biden's the way Joe Biden screws America, he clearly does. The one drug he does not need is Viagra, because he does it all day and all night long. But that mindset and mentality of what's happening with the courts is reflective of why the Supreme Court leak mattered. Right? In the past, if there had been a leaked draft opinion, nobody would believe that would impact the vote of the justices. Because for those that don't know, what happens is the court takes petitions for cert, the U.S. Supreme Court. They decide whether to grant what's called cert, which is to look at review. You need 4 of the 9 for that. Then they have briefing done by the parties and what's called amici briefs, third parties. The Roe v. Wade case had amici from everywhere. Then they do oral argument. Oral argument usually tells you where the mindset of the justices are. When that happened, I predicted that Roe v. Wade would be overturned and it would be sent back to the states, just based on the briefing and the statements by the justices at the time. It was clear there were 5 votes, probably 6, to affirm the Mississippi law, and 5 votes at least to overturn Roe v. Wade fully. based on comments and statements that were made. Now, that doesn't make abortion illegal in America. It just leaves it up to states what the future of the legality of abortion is. California is trying to figure out ways to help, pregnant mothers do meth and not have consequences when their babies die by legalizing infanticide. So there's going to be plenty of states in America where abortion is completely legal, and legal at a rate that it's not in Europe. I mean, people don't understand that in most of Europe and most of the world, abortion in the second term and the third term, late term abortions, partial are not legal. America has an extreme pro-abortion view on the world. I mean, kind of like where Russia and China was during the Soviet days and during the communist days at the peak. So, but the fact, why does a law clerk leak that opinion? Because they've seen the same Supreme Court stick their head in the sand during the pandemic and refuse to enforce constitutional liberties for a year. They've seen the same Supreme Court hesitate to rule on religious rights on vaccines and not even protect members of the military and medical community on an emergency basis by delaying a meaningful decision. They've seen the same court, even including the 3 justices appointed by Donald Trump, run and hide and cower like cowards when the election issues were right before them to at least rule on, whichever way they ruled, to at least rule on them, make a determination as to what happened in those elections and the integrity of them and the confidence we can have in them. So, of course, liberal law clerks looks up there and says, you can intimidate these justices. They will be politically terrified to question or challenge, just like an ordinary judge will be politically terrified to enforce the law as to sanctions against a Russian person or a Russian institution. To such a degree, the Boston Marathon felt confident, racially and ethnically discriminating and saying, if you are Russian or Belarusian, you cannot run in the Boston Marathon. A Boston Marathon that would have never had that terror event had they listened to Russians about the dangers of 2 certain individuals. But that's another story for another day, as I like to say. But you look at that, the confidence that clerk has to say, if I leak this, the media will celebrate the leak. A bunch of people will start stalking Supreme Court justices outside their home and threatening them outside their home. The mayor of Chicago issued this was her language, a call to arms. Can you imagine if Donald Trump on January 6th had issued an explicit call to arms? They would still have him in the same detention centers they have the January 6th protesters in. And so, which by the way, the Russians cited as an example that America doesn't really care about the rule of law. Another political problem with how that case has been handled, aside from the constitutional problems. So it shows where we're at. It's a bad state of affairs that the Supreme Court of the United States is seen by its own law clerks as so politically vulnerable to public opinion and to terror tactics, to street theater. I mean, you guys would understand better than the average American that you go, like from your historical series, the idea of street theater is a European 1920s, 1930s kind of invention. In that, in Germany, the fascists and the communists would compete, the Nazis would compete to see who could own the street, believing that if you own the street, you own the political space. It didn't quite translate that way, but in their minds it did. I mean, they're all excited about, whether it was the black shirts and the brown shirts in certain places or the Nazis or the commies in other places. It's that mindset that, Antifa has here in the United States. I mean, Antifa, again, was, a German invention, really all the way back to the days of when they were communists disguised as anti-fascists. But, the modern contemporary version of Antifa started in the 1970s in Germany. And it's the belief that if you own the streets, you can intimidate public officials to do your bidding. That's foreign to the history of the Supreme Court of the United States in America. And yet you have a law clerk within the Supreme Court who believes that's the case. And now, to be frank, if they don't issue the Alito opinion, they're going to look very, very bad, because then it will happen again and again and again. I mean, right now, Justice Alito, the U.S. Marshals who provide the security to the Supreme Court had to put him in hiding. That's how bad it is. So it's a terrifying time to be alive, in the sense of not only the risk of nuclear war, but with people, Wall Street Journal had a piece. Hey, maybe we could win a nuclear war. I mean, this George P. Scott, Dr. Strangelove thing was not supposed to be a preview. Just like Orwell's 1984 was not supposed to be a predictive script. But they sound like the Great Reset. Whenever you hear the Great Reset, it sounds like the pigs telling everybody, no, we have to have the milk and apples because it's good for you. and you have to eat the slop because that's what's necessary. But I think you're right that what happened with the Supreme Court is very scary, very frightening, and it looked like kind of the British High Court the way they wussed out on the Julian Assange case. If it looks like they could be so easily politically publicly pressured by Antifa types to change their opinion of a Supreme Court about an issue of such consequences as abortion, boy, we're in bad state in the United States.
Absolutely, because of course the Supreme Court is an absolutely pivotal part of the American constitutional structure. It's the keystone to the whole arch, because it's the body that, to my mind, administers. It tells you, it interprets the Constitution in an authoritative way. Now, if you undermine the Supreme Court, then you undermine the whole constitutional and legal system, and you strike at its foundations. Now, I have to say, I worked, as you know, in the Royal Courts of Justice in Britain. We don't have anything remotely equivalent to the Supreme Court in the US Supreme Court in Britain. We have something that's called the Supreme Court, which was created by Tony Blair, and it is a powerful court, but it is in no way analogous to the Supreme Court of the United States, because we do not have what you are very fortunate to have in the United States, which is a real constitution written out by some really extraordinary people, and one which can be used to protect and defend rights, and to, in some ways, mediate also on political struggles. So we don't have anything like that. But I have to say, if there'd been a comparable leak of a draft judgment anywhere in Britain within the higher court system, by which I mean the High Court, the Court of Appeal, or indeed the Supreme Court, or the House of Lords as it once was, well, I mean, the consequences for anybody who did that would have been enormous. We would have had police in, we would have had investigations, there would have been the lawyers on both sides would have been deeply shocked and deeply worried. And of course, in politically charged cases, the political system, the politicians would have been horrified as well. And what do we see in the United States? We see something completely different. We see a court, the Supreme Court, which I've always assumed, because of its importance and because of its historic, excellence in many ways, that Americans have an enormous deference to. Do people rush to its defense? Hardly. The White House has issued some, mealy-mouthed comments. There's no particular concern about the draft being published, and the fact that people are turning up outside the houses of Supreme Court justices is, well, it's something that some people shrug their shoulders about. And can you just repeat here on this program what you said to me before we started this program, Robert? Because I did ask whether, in fact, protesting like that outside the house of a judge would be a criminal offense. And I think, you answered that question very fully, but perhaps you could answer it again with our viewers listening.
Yeah, so there's two different aspects. One is the federal law. So you have a First Amendment right of broad protest, but that is limited by federal law. A federal law can't limit the First Amendment, but the courts can interpret it as consistent to the First Amendment, and they have. And the particular law says that when it comes to the judicial branch, you cannot stalk them individually. You cannot protest them individually at their private, anywhere outside the courtroom, period. So, and that's not limited to the lawyer or the parties. Nobody should be communicating ever to a judge outside of the official proceedings, because the worry is that will influence the judge illicitly in the sense that the judge's decision is supposed to be solely and wholly made based on what happened inside the courtroom, the legal briefings, the legal pleadings, the oral arguments, the evidence adduced, not based on anybody's third-party claim about evidence, about law, about policy, about personal threats, you name it. So that's always been legally suspect, but it turns illegal when there's a directed effort at an individual, especially at the individual's residence in particular. That's especially criminalized under federal law. It's a federal misdemeanor. It is also a state crime, and in some cases a state felony in the state of Virginia, and in most states in the United States. Many of these justices live in Virginia. The rest live in the District of Columbia for the most part. Is to actually do any picketing at a judge's house, period, ever. And again, the reason for, like, some people are confused by this. They're like, well, you can picket at a congressman's house. You can picket at a mayor's house. Yes, because that's not considered an attempt to obstruct justice, to corrupt justice on an existing court case. That's the difference here. You cannot do it for the purpose of, and they're explicitly and expressly admitting they're directly targeting a justice at his home for the purpose of changing his opinion on a pending case. That's obstruction of justice, pure and simple. So not only are there specific laws that govern this, it fits, frankly, within the general obstruction of justice charge. I have no doubt. I mean, consider this. The people who walked into the Capitol without approval on January 6th, are being prosecuted for obstruction of justice, for obstruction of a congressional proceeding, even though they were never able to obstruct it at all. So if that's obstruction of a congressional proceeding, how is directly targeting a justice at his home to make him feel uncomfortable about a pending case not obstruction of a judicial proceeding? It clearly is. All of these people could be arrested tomorrow, but none of them will be, because the political reality is that in D.C. especially, D.C. is so it's happening in the January 6 cases. Nobody can get an impartial jury in January. Roger Stone, we saw that with Roger Stone's case. It is not possible. The Antifa cases. There are a bunch of Antifa cases that effectively got no billed by grand juries or no conviction by juries, despite overwhelming evidence, because they're basically jury nullification of Antifa charges. So the D.C. jury pool is actually worse, in my opinion, than a 1950s Birmingham jury pool would have been towards Martin Luther King or civil rights movement. That's how bad the District of Columbia has become, because they welcome the politicization. They believe in, like your Birmingham jury that's corrupt, they convince themselves they're not really corrupt. The D.C. jury pool knows they're corrupt, and they're proud of it because they're doing God's business. They're doing the righteous work. And that's what I've tried to explain to people is that the new left thinks like a 1930s Marxist. They do not think like a 1960s Berkeley free speech movement liberal. This is not Abby Hoffman. This is more like Trotsky. And so their mindset is the ends always justify the means. Period. And so they're totalitarian in their mindset. That's why they are obsessed with everything, obsessed with employment, with culture, with games, with movies, with TV shows. They have to have complete control, carte blanche all the time, everywhere. But they're also authoritarian in mindset. The ends completely justify the means. And you're seeing public statements to this effect. I mean, you're seeing blue checkmark people talk about maybe someone should think about assassinating one or two of the justices. I mean, say that out loud and say, well, I'm just thinking of it as a hypothetical and a ethic. No, you're not. You're trying to put the idea out there. That's where their mindset is. The ends justify. It's very much like, Lenin or Stalin or Trotsky sitting there saying, well, we got to purge a few 100,000 people. It's necessary for the greater good. I mean, that's how the new left thinks in America, at least. I don't know about the rest of the West, but definitely in America. And so it's massive criminal behavior, just like the BLM riots throughout the summer. Like I'm thinking about writing a book about the 2020 election and calling it America's Color Revolution, to put it in the broader because the BLM was part of that. The pandemic lockdowns were part of that. All of it helped set up a situation where the election fornication could take place. But that's what's happening. It's shocking, though. People like Jonathan Turley, your old school classic liberals, are shocked at this. They're like, how in the world are all these lawyers, all these legal professionals, all these public officials, including as you note, the White House, basically green lighting, stalking and harassing a massive criminal behavior by their constituency solely to try to stop one opinion from getting issued, which, if they were to succeed, as you note, would discredit the most important legal institution, frankly, arguably in the world. Because what happens when the world witnesses this? If the United States Supreme Court can be this easily politically contaminated just by public stalking and harassment, can we have confidence in any judicial branch in any part of the world?
This is completely true. Can I just say what you described as criminal offences in the United States with respect to pressure on justices, just to also say there are criminal offences in Britain. The offences are contempt of court, which is of course an offence. It can be both criminal and civil, and sometimes not an offence at all. But I mean, it's something which is within the control of the court. But there's also a criminal offence, a specific criminal offence, which is seeking to pervert the course of justice, which is, I think, quite plausibly what this is actually. I should say I don't have any kind of background as a criminal lawyer, but I've come across these things in my time, and I have to say it seems to me that they fall squarely within this same practice. And again, I'm astonished that it's happened, that it's been able to happen in the United States. I'm amazed that it has not provoked the kind of comment that you might have expected from the people that you mentioned, lawyers, newspapers, whatever. I was reading an absolutely horrible article this morning in The Guardian by somebody who I believe is American, and who was justifying the protests against the justices, which, I mean, I was amazed that it could even appear in The Guardian. And the point I want to always say, protections of due process, the proper administration of justice, the people who need those things most are those in society who are most vulnerable. I mean, that is why they are the people who need the protection of the law more than anyone else. All of us, to some extent and at some time and in some way, need the protection of the law, from, Russian oligarchs to everybody. But the people who need it most are those who are most vulnerable, because if the law isn't there, they are the most threatened. And they were the people that the Democratic Party, once upon a time, aspired to represent. And it's staggering to me that the Democratic Party has so completely forgotten that, as, by the way, has the Labour Party in Britain. And if I could just quickly add something with respect to we've had local elections in Britain fairly recently. And it was, again, very striking that the places where the Labour Party managed to make some inroads against the Conservatives was not in the sort of working class areas which it once represented, which used to identify strongly with the Labour Party and where the Labour Party was founded, but in places like Westminster, the city of Westminster, the affluent, rich, socially liberal places in London, not amongst the working class places, as I said, which the Labour Party was once set up to create, to represent and defend. And it seems to me the Democrats have gone in exactly the same way in the United States, only much further.
Yeah, the US and the UK tend to parallel each other.
Yeah.
I follow them because they tend to be predictive of trends. So, Margaret Thatcher in 1979, well, you can even go further back. I mean, to a certain degree, was it Harold Ramsey was kind of like very kind of Carter-esque in the 70s. But Margaret Thatcher's rise in 1979 presaged Ronald Reagan in 1980. John Major presaged Poppy Bush, the very similar kind of 1988, 1990 kind of political people. Their political collapse. Bill Clinton presaged Tony Blair, who was actually advised by Stanley Greenberg, Clinton's pollster. And the mistakes of Tony Blair presaged the mistakes of George W. Bush, and both of them getting a neck deep in the Iraqi war and embracing a globalist clique as their basis and predicate of power, which led to the populist revolutions at different times that went in different directions, but that were foreshadowing things, especially Brexit and Trump. The Brexit vote heavily presaged Trump. just as the Tory success, to some degree, presaged American Republican congressional success. Now, in terms of the thing right now is that you have someone like the Tory leadership is like a Mitt Romney leadership in the States. And because that's so unpopular, you have what the Tories should be consolidating their gains. What's happening to the Tories and not doing as well as they could have in these elections should be a warning sign to Republicans in the States. Stay away from pandemic politics, embracing pandemic politics of lockdowns and mandates and the rest. Continue to oppose those, and do not get neck deep in another dumb war, another dumb foreign war, because if you do, you're going to limit your growth. Because I think if they had not jumped on the war train and had not been so neck deep in the pandemic politics, the Tories would have made major gains this past time. Because the Labor Party, as you notice, like the Democratic Party here, they're not a viable alternative for working class voters.
No.
But, nor to some extent were the Tories because of they're opening the door to a rise of a Nigel Farage independent party finally in the UK. And we'll see if that translates. But in the States, the populist alternative is more robust, but the same working class trend is happening. It's just accelerating.
Yeah.
Like Ohio, what happened in Youngstown and that area, people can go back and listen to Bruce Springsteen's song about Youngstown. That was the heart, but it's taken a heavy hit over the past several decades. And let me give an example. Northeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, key states in elections, gubernatorial and senatorial and House races upcoming in this midterms. It's steel country. It's the heart of the steel industry in the United States. Well, what did the dimwit Biden do the other day? He removed steel tariffs on Ukraine. It's like, well, hold on a second. So you're going to figure out a totally new way to screw workers in America. It's like, now it's probably going to be a while before Ukraine has a lot of exports going out anyway, so it's probably not going to matter too much. But of course, what can happen is that when you say steel from this place can come in, steel from someplace else comes in disguised as steel from there. China did this when they were getting around Trump's tariffs all the time. They just relabel, we'll send it to the Philippines and boom, we'll send it here and boom. So, it's the problem with sanctions in the modern global environment, which Russian oil is the perfect example. Yeah. How do you figure out it's Russian, right? Is the oil does it sing a song or does it do something, magic? It's not there. So ultimately, I think that this politically will backfire in terms of what's happening in the Supreme Court. I think there'll be 5 justices that will stick with the Alito opinion precisely because of this. I think they would have likely gone there anyway, but Kavanaugh is a real, back and forth kind of guy. He was only put on the bench because Kennedy told Trump he would only retire if he would anoint Kavanaugh. So that's how Kavanaugh got picked. Barrett was just a bad choice by Trump. Some of us told him at the time. He didn't listen, unfortunately, but he's getting a little bit better. But there you have the defense secretary. It's kind of a temporary defense secretary, but still a defense secretary. Esper goes on 60 Minutes and just bashes Trump and talks about how he was basically planning quasi-coup-like behavior towards Trump while he was in Trump's administration. And Trump has to put out a thing saying, rhinos told me to hire him. And it's like, well, maybe don't listen to those opinions anymore. Like Sean Hannity was encouraging him to endorse his old friend, Dr. Oz. Oz voted in Turkey in 2018. So it's kind of, an unusual U.S. senator to have a guy who voted in Turkey to be running for the United States Senate. And it'll be interesting to watch in Pennsylvania. There's a candidate, Kathy Barnett, that comes up. She's kind of new to the populist platform, but she's at least the only one voicing populist concerns opposed to globalism. Called out the World Economic Forum, called out the globalist effort, is starting to make anti-war statements to that effect. And she's surging. And she has almost no money. She's gone from single digits to double digits and within the margin of error of first place just by embracing this populist platform. So the populist platform is an anti-war platform, still is. And I get the anti-war left that still keeps interpreting this as an American empire. They're misunderstanding. I get it if you want to I get Putin sort of jabbing Europe, saying you're the junior partners to America because French, do you feel good with them saying garçon, whatever, the Brits, do you feel good being the little puppy following the dog? I get that it works to appeal to a European audience, but as a mantra as a filter, as a predictive filter, an explanatory filter, it doesn't really work. One, empires actually deliver goods for the benefit of the people most of the time. At least popular empires do. You know, the Mongol, there was both folks at home in Mongolia weren't unhappy with the Mongolian Empire. You know, the people at home in the Vikings or the French or the British or the Russians or the Austro-Germans or the Ottomans, any of them, they all profited from the empire. The American people do not benefit from these imperial adventures. They, in fact, all they're going to do is lose treasure and lose blood. It's part of Trump's point. Like, Trump's argument wasn't like just an instinctive anti-war argument. It was, what good is this? We're going to lose money and lose men. Why? What for? I don't get it. This is very much a globalist empire vision, a globalist clique that has that uses its most powerful institutions, which is really the European Union. Second, the Biden administration. But there is not deep support within the American public for any of this.